Hello, my name is Brian Manternach. I use he, him pronouns. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Theater at the University of Utah and a research associate at the National Center for Voice and Speech. On behalf of my associate Lynn Maxfield, thank you for attending this presentation. Acoustic and Perceptual Qualities of Music Theater Mix in 4 Professional Singers. So we started with 4 questions. We wanted to see if professional music theater singers um, are there measurable differences between their belt singing, their mix singing, and their legit singing? Can we use acoustic measures to identify if mix more closely resembles belt or more closely resembles legit? And then when we put the sound in front of professional casting directors, will they be able to differentiate between belt, mix, and legit sounds? And then how will they perceive mix? Will they hear the mix as being closer to belt or closer to legit? So this is a continuation of a study that we've been doing for a number of years. I think this is going to be the last component of it. We took 4 cisgender women singers, music theater singers, who had all performed professionally, regularly in equity music theater productions at the regional level. And then for our auditors, we had 5 casting directors who work at equity music theater companies. What we had the singers do is sing a 5-note scale, ah, sustaining the top note for 5 seconds. We excerpted 2.5 seconds of that for analysis. We had them do it in 4 different keys so that the top notes that they were singing were a C5, a D flat 5, a D5, and an E flat 5. So that upper middle voice for these women. And then we asked them to do each of those scales in what they perceive to be a legit style, what they perceive to be a mixed style, and what they perceive to be a belt style, again, on each of those 4 pitches. Here are the materials we use. You can pause the screen if you'd like to look more extensively at that. And then we use the Praat voice and speech analysis software to look at these particular measures, which I'll go through one at a time. Once we got to the professional casting directors, we randomized those samples and played them for these directors. And we asked them on this visual analog scale to place a check mark whether they felt what they were hearing was a belt, was legit, or was somewhere in between. And for purposes of this study, we just took the left-hand third of that, and we said, okay, that's going to qualify as belt. The middle third would qualify as mix, and then that right-hand third would qualify as legit. So when we looked at jitter on all of these samples, in 15 of the 16, almost 94%, belt did have a lower rating than legit. But when we looked at mix, in only 10 of those samples was mix actually between belt and legit. And when we look more specifically at those 10, it was almost half and half as to whether the mix was closer to belt or closer to legit. Similar numbers when we looked at shimmer. It was 81% of those samples had belt lower than legit, but in only 5 of those samples did mix reside between belt and legit. And again, about a split as to whether those mixed sounds were closer to belt or closer to legit. We looked at spectral slope. 87.5% of the samples showed belt with a shallower slope than legit. And that represents all 4 samples from 3 of the 4 singers, 2 of the 4 samples from the 4th singer. But in only 6 of those samples was, again, mix between belt and legit. Noise to harmonic ratio is a little different. When we're looking at belt versus legit, you see for those top 3 singers, singers 1, 2, and 3, 11 of the 12 samples had a higher noise to harmonic number for belt than it did for legit, but for singer number 4 it was completely flipped, where they had a lower number for the belt noise to harmonic ratio than they did on their legit pitches. When we looked at mix, again, greater mix, greater variability on the mix according to the noise harmonic ratio. Once we got into CPPS, this is where we started to see more consistency. So you can see for singer number 1, in each of the 4 pitches were they ordered. Legit had the lowest number, mix had the middle number, and belt had the highest number. So on all 4 pitches, they were ordered legit, mix, belt. When we zeroed in on the mix, you can see that on all 4 pitches for this singer, the mix more closely resembled legit than it did belt. And we compared that to the auditors, and once again, on the top 3 pitches, they ordered legit on that far third, mix in the middle third, and belt on the other far third. So they ordered mix between legit and belt. And they also, according to their check marks, were hearing mix as closer to legit on 3 of those 4 pitches. Now the 4th pitch was interesting, where the mix number actually was closer to the legit side of that visual analog scale than the legit was. So we're, for purposes of this study, referring to those pitches where the mix exceeds legit. We're calling those too legit to quit. For subject number 2, similar numbers. For the lower 3 pitches, again, they were all ordered legit mix belt, and the mix was seen as being closer to legit than it was to belt. Once again, for that top pitch, the mix was closer to the legit side, was actually had a lower number than legit, so we had one of those that was too legit to quit. When we compared the auditors on 3 of the 4 pitches, they were ordered appropriately, and two of the mixes were closer to belt, 1 was closer to legit, 1 was too legit to quit. For the third singer, again, all 4 pitches were ordered appropriately. 2 of them were seen as legit, and 2 actually closer to belt when we looked at the mixes. But once we compared that to what the auditors heard, again, 3 of the 4 pitches were ordered appropriately. 3 of the 4 pitches were heard, where the mix was heard as closer to legit than to belt, and 1 pitch was too legit to quit. And then we look at the 4th singer. Again, on 3 of the 4 pitches, they were ordered appropriately. Mix was heard, mix was rated, according to the CPPS, as closer to legit than it was to belt, with that 4th pitch being too legit to quit. And compared to the auditors, that on 3 pitches, not the same 3, but on 3 of the pitches, they were ordered appropriately. 3 of those mixes were closer to legit, and 1 of those mixes was too legit to quit. So if we look at what this might tell us, jitter, shimmer, and spectral slope were actually fairly reliable when distinguishing from belt to legit. We found them to be less reliable at placing mix between those 2. Noise harmonic was slightly less reliable than jitter, shimmer, and spectral slope at distinguishing belt from legit. And when we looked at the mix, it really varied from singer to singer. CPPS, though, was the most reliable of these measures at actually placing mix between belt and legit in 87.5% of our samples. It identified mix as closer to legit than closer to belt. So the mix actually lied closer to legit on 75% of those examples. And if we consider the too legit to quit samples, where the legit was heard as more legit than legit, or rated further to that side of the spectrum, then those numbers go up to 87.5%. When we looked at what the casting directors did and how that aligned with what the singers were doing, casting directors may accurately perceive mix as between belt and legit. From these casting directors with these singers, that occurred 75% of the time. They may also perceive mix as more resembling legit than belt, that was seen in the majority of tokens, 62.5. If we consider the too legit to quit numbers, that goes up to 87.5. So mix may not ultimately be definable as residing on a spectrum between belt and legit, since of all of these measures, CPPS was the only one that seemed to be the most accurate determinant at placing them in that predicted order. Obvious limitations for this study is a very small sample size with only 4 singers and only 4 auditors, so future studies should look for greater numbers to consider. And this was just a one-time sample, so if we wanted to see if these trends are more indicative of greater trends, we would probably want to have more singers and test them more than just once. Thank you for your attention. If you have questions about this presentation, please attend the Q&A. I look forward to seeing you there.